Good. And okay. Can everyone see the paper?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you. So this is a paper that was one of the outstanding or spotlight papers from ICML this year, and I chose it because I felt like it had simple enough theory that I wouldn't have to go into a massive amount of detail to understand it, and also it drew some interesting conclusions. After reading it, I found that it's a really cool paper. It's about disentanglement, which, sorry, there's a lot of things I want to say as an introduction to this. Yeah, I'll start with that. So what is disentanglement? When you think about machine learning models, usually the most basic version of them is you think of it as like a set of inputs and a model and then a set of outputs. And but what's happening within the model is that it has multiple layers. And say the set of inputs that you have are things that, let's choose a basic task, which would be like classifying whether a picture is a cat or a dog. And then you have like an image of the dog that you put into the model. Now, ideally, what you'd want, or what we think we want at least, because maybe that's not what we want, but at least this is where we're going right now, is that, so you input that image of a cat, and then the individual layers in the model, and specifically the neurons within the layer, which are essentially like specific dimensions that are like the output of each layer, of the vector that's the output of each layer, they correspond to something both interpretable and meaningful towards the task. So like with this cat example, you would want like one of the neurons to respond to pointy ears and also be able to show that it's responding to pointy ears. And then another one to point to maybe having like less of an elongated snout. So these are features that are like task variables, as they say right up here, specific task variables. And a disentangled representation is one where like the specific, we'll call them neurons now. So each, like I said, a model has multiple layers, and each layer it has like a set of neurons, which are just the outputs of that layer. Because each layer, let's say, outputs a vector, and each neuron is like one of the dimensions of that vector. So what you want is that the output of that of each neuron is something both interpretable and specific, like a specific task variable. Because if you have you have a neuron that's like saying, okay, it kind of recognizes long snouts and it kind of recognizes pointy ears, you can't really tell what it's recognizing. So that's why you want something that's disentangled and it's focusing on a specific feature. And so this paper is about disentanglement. And what's really interesting about it is that they take these two constraints that they've identified in how neurons work, and they first do some proofs with these two constraints, showing that if you use these two constraints to train models, then the optimal solution is will lead to a disentangled internal representation. Then they go on to show in practice how even when you take away some of the strong assumptions they make in their proofs, that they still see disentangled representations being learned. And then they go on to apply all of this to neuroscience to actually explain some of the phenomenon that we see in neuroscience that we didn't know, we couldn't provide an explanation for. So I think it's a really interesting paper because you have some theory, which is quite interesting, but not too hard to understand, partly because they do such a good job of creating good diagrams. And then you have how it applies to machine learning, and something you don't normally see in machine learning papers, how it applies to neuroscience and what impact it has there. So with that in mind, let's start going through this paper. Oh, there was one last thing I wanted to say about this. Like I said, they're taking some constraints that they've identified about how neurons operate in the brain and applying them to mathematical models and how we learn mathematical models. And what I found interesting about this is that these constraints that you see in the two constraints, by the way, are non-negativity and energy efficiency. These two constraints that you see are not something that you would automatically apply to a model, but we choose to apply to a model because we think that they're useful. And so they're showing they're useful for disentanglement. But I think this is a really good example of how in machine learning often, we can't find any empirical evidence for why we should apply a specific technique to a method. And we have to introduce additional assumptions. Like, for example, the assumption here is that the biological constraint used by neurons is also useful for machine learning and mathematical modeling, and that you can apply it to both and that it's useful. So I think that's an interesting point because it shows how a lot of the problems that we work on are not ones where you can just through first principle determine what solution you should be using and what's the best solution. One thing I'll say is that both of the techniques that they use to enforce non-negativity and energy efficiency are techniques that are automatically used by all of our models already. So that's an interesting thing too, that like somehow these are baked into the models that we use. Okay, so let's go through this paper. In the introduction, they just talk about how if there's a comment or question, feel free to just maybe Vahan, can you read it out? Unless it's not important. Okay, so
there is no comment. You can continue.
Okay, thank you. So the introduction is really just one thing I'll say is that these authors are definitely more in the field of neuroscience than in ML because they use a lot of terminology that's specific to neuroscience, and it makes the paper a little bit harder to understand. Like they say over here, such understandings can lead to better, more interpretable artificial neural networks, as well as provide insights into how biological networks mediate cognition. In neuroscience, mediate means to control or to cause it to happen. Whereas I think in a lot of other contexts, it has another meaning. But basically, this first introductory paragraph is just talking about how we know some things about neurons, but one thing we don't know specifically is why specific neurons in the brain respond to specific task variables. So, like, for example, why you have a specific neuron in your brain that will fire up when you're trying to figure out where you are, or why you have a specific neuron in your brain that will fire up when you have a cat. Just because we don't know how we get these disentangled representations within our brain. And they give over here just a lot of examples. Yeah?
Sorry, you have a question about entangled. What entangled means? Does it mean that you cannot easily interpret by observing singular neurons and groups of neurons?
Maybe I could show you guys through a diagram in the paper.
That would be good, yes.
Okay. So see these. Let's just look at A. We're going to go into more detail as we go through the math of this, but for now, let's just look at figure 2A. So let's pretend that each color is a specific task variable, like pointy ears or elongated snout, or maybe even like type of fur or something like that. And the input to your model most likely will be some kind of mixture of all of those features. Like here, each of these circles in X is a mixture of 2 features, but it could be many more, like the example I gave you of an image, where the image has many features in it. It's just a mixture of features. And a disentangled, the difference between a disentangled representation is the difference between, so an entangled representation would be BA1, so that middle vector, where you still see that internal representation within the model has a mixture of the components, so it's multiple colors at once. Whereas a entangled representation, this is an entangled representation, and then a disentangled representation is where the internal components, the internal neurons are only picking up on a specific feature. So somehow when you map X to A1 with W1, you're able to extract what that feature value is. So you could say like has pointy ears or not, or has an elongated snout. So disentanglement is especially in this context, it's like you have specific features that are important to a task, and you want your model to internally recognize those features or be able to measure them and then make decisions based on measuring them. And so a disentangled representation that you want to use is one that you want is one where you are able to distinguish, like there's at least one neuron for each different task variable that's important to the task, as opposed to them being mixed. So you can't really tell what their value is because they're mixed. I hope this picture helps illustrate what I'm talking about a little bit better. If not, feel free to ask another question and I'll keep going down this road. But let's keep moving forward as we go through this. So yeah, this first paragraph was just talking about how like we don't understand why certain neural representations are entangled versus not entangled, and like that they represent specific factors. And then so this is talking about neuroscience, but they also talk about how in machine learning we want to have disentangled factors of representation within our model. So and the reasons for that are because there's a lot of arguments that it will lead to better interpretability. That's the main thing we see it used for, and then also for generalization and reasoning. So both in neuroscience to understand the brain and in machine learning, there are many reasons why we would want to understand how to learn a disentangled representation. So this paper is about how by enforcing the biological constraints of non-negativity and minimizing energy, you lead to a factorized representation in neural networks, which is basically saying leads to a disentangled representation. And so I'm not going to go through this proof. I will mention something about it. Instead, I want to talk to you guys about this diagram, because this diagram is such a good way to understand the proof. For this diagram, and for the proof, they make one assumption, which is that the internal representation of Z has some fixed variance. Because if it didn't, and you applied these two constraints, then the optimal solution would be one that was where everything was zero. So they have to ensure that there's some fixed variance, and that's why you can see that in all three of these diagrams there's a fixed variance. And then the other thing is, where is it? Oh yeah, that I just wanted to say the reason they also point out that if there is no fixed variance and it's like they're ensuring that the neural representation retains some information about the task variables. So like that's a good justification for it. You need some fixed variance in this method. We'll see later on when they don't make that assumption anymore. But anyway, so with that assumption, if you look at the equation above, this is the equation for some task. So E1 is one task variable. E2 is some other task variable. And then your neurons are actually these two vectors. And so if you look all the way to the right, you can see that the neurons have a disentangled representation, which means that there's a 1 in one dimension of the vector and a 1 and a 0 everywhere else. And so the first thing that they point out is that they say, like, okay, this first one, this on the left, this diagram on the left, it doesn't enforce non-negativity or energy efficiency.
Quick question.
Yeah.
The E1 and E2, they are just sort of like weights of in that, so they're just regular numbers, right?
So I think it's a bit confusing how they've done it, but these are actually the task variables. So E1 and E2 are not part of the model. They're like the inputs. Like it would be like X1 and X2.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So, but they're like a linear number, a scalar that's sort of
Yeah.
like a mixing component. Weight is probably not a good term because they can be negative, right? It's just they are, yeah, somewhere on this linear discriminant. If the variable is very large, we have it very clearly in one state. If say E2 is very small, it's very clearly in the other state, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Arvid. And so in this first picture, you're not enforcing non-negativity or minimizing activity energy. And so they say, like, okay, let's enforce non-negativity. And the way they do that is by increasing the bias term. So the bias term in the first equation is 0, 0, whereas the bias term in the second equation is what you see here. It's like the activation term. They call it like minimum activation, this bias term. And it means that any single point on this square, which is like the variation you see in E1 and E2, will always be lead to a non-negative result. But when you do that, you actually increase the total amount of energy that's used to calculate the internal representation. I actually spent a good amount of time trying to tie this equation for energy to like how neurons work, and I couldn't do it. But I think if someone studied neuroscience, they might be able to.
So I think I actually was wrong. The E1 and E2 must be at least fine, right? Because it says uniformly distributed. That they can't be, they must be within that box, right?
Yeah, they must be within this box.
So the same thing between 0 and 1 actually might actually work, yeah.
So yeah, sorry. Maybe I'll say that they make the assumption in the proof that E is a random vector who has k independent components, they're the task factors. And then for each task factor is independent of the other ones, has a mean of 0 and a variance of sigma squared, and has a maximum and minimum value of -a and a.
Yep.
So it's like a truncated Gaussian.
Yep.
Or like some other distribution that fits all those criteria.
Thank you.
Yeah. But the point is that when you enforce this non-negativity constraint, then all of a sudden you're using a lot more energy to calculate your neural representation. And so the only way to minimize activation energy is actually to align the neurons with the task variables. And there's a proof for that, but that's the basic point that, okay, neurons work. One of the constraints of how neurons work is they have, I guess, non-negative signals. I also couldn't understand. I tried to read some stuff about neurons to understand how these two constraints tie. I wish they had like a 22-minute YouTube video about how these apply in neurons. But anyway, yeah.
So by energy and minimization of energy, does this mean basically like in machine learning, this would be the complexity of the calculation?
Actually, I think it would be like.
It's almost more like in
more like
regularization, right? Like how regularized the solution is.
It's more like how large the numbers get. I think that's how I view it.
Right.
So like instead of over here, essentially, you can think of the distance from the origin as like the size, maybe the magnitude of. That's not completely correct, but like the magnitude of the internal representation. And if you want to minimize like the average magnitude, like the expected magnitude, then you would have to align the axes of the neurons with the axes of the task variables.
Okay, so it's almost analogous to like electrical signal, I don't know, voltage in neural transmission.
Yeah,
Like
I think.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, I wish I knew more about how neurons work, but it's a pretty dense field when you start going down into it. So we'll just say, like, for now, this is like, we'll take this simple model as neurons have non-negative impulses and that they minimize activity energy. And so this is how you would do both things if you have to enforce both constraints. Yeah, so that's kind of like their first result in terms of theorems, which is that if you enforce non-negativity and you enforce energy efficiency, then you get a disentangled internal representation.
Peter, I've got a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I might have understood it incorrectly, but when we say enforce non-negativity, does that mean the overall that term, sum of variance of Zj, that should be positive, or the individual matrix associated with those scalars, they should have positive terms? Because you notice that on the perfectly minimized activity energy, the last neuron, you can see the matrices are positive for all three, E1, E2, the associated matrices. So when they say non-negativity forcing, does that mean those elements in the column vectors have to be positive, or the whole thing has to be positive? Jeez.
Thanks for the question. So non-negativity, what it means is that Z, so this is an equation for Z, and you know that E1 and E2 can be at least minus A and at most A. So you know what A is. And so you know the bounds of like how large or small Z can be. And so what you do is you add a bias. See, like there's no bias on the left. You add a bias to Z such that no matter what values of E1 and E2 you get, you'll always have a positive value or positive or non-negative value. So it could be 0 as well for Z. So it's just enforcing that Z is always non-negative. So that's the non-negativity constraint. And then for each of these equations, there's also a way to calculate the expected energy, I guess. I guess it's like expected value of Z squared. And so, or the expected norm of Z squared. Yeah, the expected norm of Z squared. That makes more sense. And so they're saying like, okay, if you look, if the axes of the neurons aren't aligned with the axes of the task variables, then you have a larger energy because you have this 1.4 squared factor that you're multiplying the second term by. So yeah, that's how the two constraints are enforced. And then, okay, we talked about the first proof, and the key thing is for the first proof, what they say is that they have to enforce like some constant variance, non-zero variance, in order to not have an optimal solution, which is just to have Z be 0 all the time. But then they create a slightly more complex problem, and they prove some stuff for that. So for this problem, again, you have E is your task variables, and then you have some matrix D that transforms the task variables into a mixture of themselves, X, where it could, like, say maybe you have 2 task variables, you could have 3 mixture variables, or 5 or 10, doesn't matter. And so now you're not actually directly getting to observe the independent task factors, like the things that allow you to complete the task, which is a lot more realistic as like a formulation than if you could observe them directly, because we can almost never observe directly the things that we want to accomplish a task with a mathematical model. But at the same time, one thing that's not here, which means that a lot of these results, I think, like one thing that's not here is there's no noise in the observation. So you don't have like some plus noise representation of like what X is. There's no, it's just like a straight on mapping. Anyway, just a comment there. And then they say, besides that, instead of enforcing a constant variance, we're going to say that you can use the internal representation with a linear mapping to recover X. So if you're trying to do that to recover X and you enforce that that's possible, then you know that you can't have Z be 0 for everything because there would be no way to recover X. So for this second set of proofs, they just say, okay, we're going to mix. Now the model only sees a mixture of the task variables, not the individual task variables. And we're going to use what they call a generative model, linear model, to recover the original X. And they make some assumptions. But basically what they show is that, again, if you enforce non-negativity, they make some assumptions about D, which I have underlined here. If you make some if you apply non-negativity and minimization of energy, again, the internal representation Z will be disentangled. And I think this is a really cool result, and they just say it here. It says, strikingly, the essential concept of theorem 2 is that any linear, non-negative, optimally energetic efficient generative neural representation that accurately predicts entangled observations, that accurately predicts entangled observations that are linear mixtures of blah, 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 will possess single neurons that are selective for individual task factors, despite never having access to them. So if we look back at this diagram over here, it's basically saying that, okay, your input is going to be like this mixture of the task variables you care about. But somehow, if you enforce these constraints while you're training your model, it will learn a disentangled representation. So without you saying anything, it's able to actually pick out the task variables that are important and learn a single, and train at least one neuron to pick up on them. I think that's quite cool, to be honest. Like a really cool result.
One quick question. How does it compare to principal component analysis, right? Where you also have like a data space, which has some hidden components that where you assume they have some finite variance, and you try to rotate your space into such a way that the system essentially becomes like you have independent components, which is also what sort of the assumption is on these factors, right? You sort of assume that these factors E are sort of independent, distributed from each other, no?
Yeah, these factors are independently distributed from each other. It could be very similar, to be honest. Maybe as we go through the math of this, because I'll just show you some of the training equations they used, you'll be able to tell us how similar they are. But to be honest, now that you say that, well, I guess principal component analysis assumes that you're learning from.
Well, I'm just wondering because there must be some, you know, when you have your observations, right? Your standard E's are multiplied by different vectors, right? Otherwise, would these vectors have to be different in size in order for this to work? Because otherwise, it almost feels like you can always sort of rotate your components and like mix them together and to get a new component that is also a linear is also a linear factor, and you wouldn't be wrong necessarily about it.
Well, so maybe this will help answer your question. One of the assumptions they make is that the columns of D are scaled and orthonormal to each other. So they're assuming that like that mixture that results in X is the mixture of like a set of orthogonal vectors, essentially.
Yes, I think that would still be your independent assumptions, right? But again, you can always re-orthogonalize it to any other state, no? It's more. But when they say scaled, what do they mean by that?
It means that you could they could be, so they're not orthogonal, or sorry, they're not, the magnitude of each vector isn't 1. It could be like varied. It could be like 100, one could be 100, one could be 2, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, because I almost think that must be necessary in order for this to work. No?
Yeah, I'm sure it is. They say that, they even say, like, we note that having a scaled orthonormal column may seem like a strong constraint, but it holds approximately for any random matrix D with many observations.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
But I was thinking, like, how about in practice? But anyway, this is just the theory part.
I have a question. Sorry, Peter. I was thinking about what you were talking about, how all this relates to PCA, but could, in principle and in theory, would you have certain neuron vectors that could have same principal components, the eigenvectors and eigenvalue, but the fact that this solution, this principle actually using the energy minimization as it talks about, gives a unique solution to each of those vectors? Is that how what's making it different to your standard PCA?
I don't know if it gives a unique solution, because one thing they point out is they have a different definition of disentanglement than what's previously been studied, because in previous like studies of disentanglement, they say that each neuron needs to, actually, even in that case, you could just permute the neurons. If you say that the neurons are just a set and not an ordered list, then the previous studies of disentanglement, where each neuron only studies a single, is only supposed to pick up on a single task factor, that would be a unique solution. But here, disentanglement to them, it doesn't matter if multiple neurons pick up on the same task factor. It's just that each neuron should only pick up on a single task factor.
Yep.
So it's built in within the definition of disentanglement.
For them, the way they've defined it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So that they might be jumping the gun a bit, but did they mention whether the energy form matters, right? So they here they use squared, like the L2 norm essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Would it make a difference whether if you change that to, I don't know, L1 or L1/2 or so?
Yeah, they don't mention anything like that, but maybe it's in the proofs later on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good question. But anyway, again, the result of theorem 2 is just that for all these assumptions are respected, then you can have a model whose internal representation is able to disentangle the task factors without actually them being the input to the model. And then they're like, okay, well, all of the assumptions we made are pretty strong. How does this pan out in practice? Like where the assumptions that we made probably don't apply. Like, are these constraints still useful? And so we'll go through that, but I just want to say one thing I think is a contribution of this paper is like having the different definition of disentanglement that we talked about, where they only care about that each neuron picks up on a specific task factor and not that only one neuron does. So they propose a new metric, which they call mutual information ratio, as opposed to what's been used before, which is mutual information gap. And they point out some failings of the other methods, which is like one, the other methods would penalize a representation that where one of the underlying task variables is picking up on is not one-dimensional. So, and the example they give you over here is like spatial location is 2 or 3 dimensional, or 6, depending on how you want to define it. And so if you had a neuron that was firing because of your spatial location, all of these previous metrics would penalize that. And then also they point out that the point they're making, because I guess with the math that they're doing, there's no guarantee that a single neuron will pick up on a single factor. Multiple neurons might pick up on a factor. So they just want something that doesn't penalize, a metric that doesn't penalize them for that. Okay, so let's talk about how they enforce the constraints in the mathematical models they're using. So for the non-negativity constraint, they do one of two things. They use ReLU, which is what we use all the time, to enforce non-negative activations, or they have a soft constraint they put in the loss, where they're like training the model to output positive activations. Okay, I think that's the end of this page. Oh, I don't think we're going to get through all of the paper, but I'll try to get through the machine learning part of it because it's pretty interesting. And then, so in terms of in terms of minimizing energy, they enforce that constraint using two things. It's actually the constraint that they're minimizing is minimum energy of activations. So the L2 norm of activations is as low as possible. And then also of the weights in the model. So the weights in the linear model you're learning. So they enforce both of those constraints. Now, and then, so the loss that they use would be, that they train a model with would be the non-negativity, or they'll use ReLU, so non-negativity term, the minimizing activations, minimizing weights, and then whatever the actual prediction goal is, what you're trying to actually predict. Interestingly, I think it's really common, well, if we put ReLU instead of this non-negativity loss, and we take out the activity loss, like this loss here, we usually train our models with those constraints anyway, like of weight, like weight minimization and like weight energy and minimization, and then also positivity. So it's already in there in our models.
Sorry, how does the non-negativity loss again look like in detail?
Yeah, sorry, I'll go back up to it. It's right over here. So AI would be like the output of an activation function, or just probably the linear model. And so they're just saying like whichever one is greater, and they'll train a model with that.
Yeah, so it's also sort of linear. Yeah, it is linear. Yeah.
Hmm.
Cool. Yeah, no, it's piecewise linear, but it's not. Yeah, it's non-linear, but piecewise linear. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting about, I was thinking to myself, I wonder if we'll start enforcing a constraint on activities, like activation outputs. And I actually have seen this before in models related to uncertainty estimation in a different way. We've actually presented papers on not where we train the model within a loss that was to minimize the activation magnitudes, but instead we forced a model to enforce like what's called a Lipschitz constraint on the activations. I think so. They would never get too large. But it was the same thing where you're like forcing the activations to stay within a certain magnitude. Whereas this one's a soft constraint, the other one was a hard constraint. Maybe in the future we'll start adopting that for all our models. Who knows?
Yeah. Wasn't Lipschitz also something that that says that if your inputs are sufficiently far apart, the outputs also should be far apart, but yeah, not too much, but also
it was more like you upper bound the output of the model, based on the input of your model.
Yeah.
So I guess it's not super similar, but it's just that it's also enforcing a constraint on the activations.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this is how they train the model, and so first they train a linear model with on simulated data, and the results are here. This is what we were looking at before. Like, I'll zoom into this plot so we can talk about the results. So they're training a linear model, which is essentially has no hidden layers. It just goes to internal representation and then to Y. W1 and W2 with the constraints that they're talking about for this simulated data. And so what you see is MIR is their metric for disentanglement, and higher is better. So what they have is the blue and the orange are both enforcing all of the constraints that they want to enforce, and they get pretty good results. And then the green one, which is the third best performing, they're not enforcing weight energy minimization. And the other, this is basically the poor performing ones are ablation studies, just showing you what's important. You can see like non-negativity is actually quite important because when it's not enforced, you get the worst results in terms of disentanglement. And then the second worst one is when you don't enforce energy minimization. Yeah, so you can see that those are the results for a linear model. And one point they make is that, lastly, we note the sparsity constraints do not induce disentanglement, because they point out that I think ReLU enforces, like, pushes models to have sparse representations, but when they tested, when they trained models with sparsity in mind, they actually didn't end up having high disentanglement scores, which is what's in the appendix. So they're saying, thus, the disentanglement effect of ReLU is not from sparsity, but instead from non-negativity, which I thought was a little bit counterintuitive, but cool, because it's like, oh wow, like, you'd think that sparsity would help with disentanglement, but they're suggesting that that's not the case. Interesting result. So after they did this simple, shallow, supervised neural network, they did one where they made the data nonlinear by, instead of having x be like like x being just be a linear mapping from task variables, it's x cubed. So they cubed the mixture, and then y remains the same, and they had a deeper network that they used. And what they found was that the earlier layers of the network still mixed task variables, but the later layers still disentangled them, which is pretty cool. And they say the reason why the earlier layers didn't disentangle the representation is because earlier layers cannot be linear and hidden task factors, since they are required to perform nonlinear computations on the nonlinear data. But it makes sense that the later layers are disentangled, because then you can make better decisions, like basically output the right thing for the later layers. And then the next, and I think the results are here for, yeah, they're right here for that. You can see that, let's see, A is for linear data, so all of the layers achieved high mutual information ratio. But when you have nonlinear data, the first couple layers had the worst mutual information ratio, and then the other ones had higher, which you can see over here in 3B. And then they did another experiment where they trained a model in an unsupervised way. And the results for that are over here. Again, they're training on A is a linear model, and B is nonlinear data, and C is linear data. But what you can see is when they enforce all their constraints, they get a much higher disentanglement score again. So all of that. Okay. And then the last thing that they do, which I actually thought needed a little bit more explanation, but they are like, okay, well, we've shown you that these constraints enforce disentanglement, even experimentally. But what about all of these data sets that are geared towards measuring disentanglement? How do we perform there? So they chose a data set. Where is it? Maybe we'll just go to the results. And then they chose a data set, and they compared all of their models in terms of disentanglement. Oh yeah, here's it. We train on Shape's 3D data set with 2 examples shown in A. These images have 6 underlying factors. They actually don't report the MIR. They report mixed information gap instead. And they are showing the results for different combinations of like using ReLU versus not using ReLU, and then using a V, like a different value for V. So just so you know what each of these things mean, ReLU is, when they're saying ReLU, they're not talking about, they're training a variational autoencoder, and they're not talking about having ReLU on the within the encoder or the decoder. Instead, it's on the representation outputted by the decoder, which usually doesn't have a ReLU on it. So this is enforcing that the output of the encoder, which is usually like the mean and variance, but specifically the mean, will be always non-negative if they add ReLU. Then Vita VAE, that's enforcing a like trying to make the activations, or like again the output smaller, the activation smaller. You can think of it that way. And then Vita weight is like the weights of the model. So you can see that as you enforce, over here it's showing that if the more you enforce weight constraints, the better the performance is. And then over here they're showing that as you, well, first they show that like if you don't have ReLU, you perform worse. I guess, yeah. But anyway, the combination of ReLU and minimizing the activations has the highest performance. And they say something over here about, I guess, so the y-axis of this plot is reconstruction error, and the x-axis is mutual information gap. And they're saying that their models are in some Goldilocks zone for this data set where they get good reconstruction error and good mutual information gap. But I couldn't really tell that from the results. I guess their models are the blue, orange, and green one. But also this, I guess, yeah, this pink one does pretty well. It's a little bit hard to tell from what they were showing here, in my opinion. But anyway, they're showing that they get near state-of-the-art performance on a benchmark data set and disentanglement just by enforcing these constraints. Where really the only thing they're doing differently, I think, than everyone else is this ReLU function at the end of the encoder and imposing a higher constraint on the activations of the output of the encoder. Okay, how much time do we have? We have 10 minutes. I don't really, let's see if maybe I'll try to go through. So this is all the information. This is the half of the paper that's about machine learning models. But then they go into explaining how these same constraints lead to distinct cell types and disentangled cell types in the brain, which is quite interesting. I don't feel like I have enough time to go into a lot of depth. So let me just quickly go through and try to choose one if I'm going to say anything. Okay, well, what I'm gonna do is I'll spend 3 minutes talking about the first experiment, and then I'll open up the floor for questions, just so we have some time if anyone wants to ask questions, or we'll finish early. So I'll give you the setting, which is that one thing that they've noticed in the brain, that for specific tasks, the brain develops specific types of cells. And the 2 cells that they are focused on here are, one is called a grid cell, which is GC, and one is called an object vector cell, which is OVC, as you see here. And they don't know why the brain develops these types of cells. And these 2 cells have very specific functions in the brain. There's actually a part of the brain where these types of cells exist, and they think the function of that part of the brain is used for locating yourself and then locating other things, and like kind of as a consequence moving towards those things. And so what grid cells, based on my understanding of this paper, because again, there's a lot of neuroscience in here that I don't know about, what grid cells do is they're actually used as like kind of to create a map of the environment. So they're not used to like target a specific object or location or something like that. They're just used for you to understand your environment. And they have a very interesting shape. You can see it here. They form like a hexagonal lattice in your brain. Whereas OVC cells, what they do is that they actually are used to locate objects and consequently move towards them. They don't form like some kind of hexagonal lattice, but they fire when you're near that object or when you see that object. So that's how they work. And so what they do is that and what they found through, I don't know how they figured this out, but if you train an RNN, then it actually learns, train an RNN in like locating object tasks. It actually learns patterns that are very similar to these two types of cells. So you can see over here in D, this looks a lot like grid cells, and then their point in F, I'll talk about F in a second. But anyway, so they train an RNN to perform like a locating task. And then they, what they just show you is that they have two variations of the task. One of the tasks is just like you're moving around. The other task is you're moving towards an object. And so what they show is with the RNN that you train, when it doesn't matter whether you're looking for an object or not, you still get these like grid-like patterns through the RNN. This is the space that I won't get that. And if there are objects which are these white dots, then you also get it. So this is kind of like grid cells, where grid cells are there no matter what the task is, as long as you want to know where you are in your environment. And then you have these, and then they point out that you also have these like OVC patterns coming up where, so red means that you get a high activation in the space when you're there, and blue means you don't. So you can see that there's really high activations near the objects and zero everywhere else. So when you do have like an object that you're moving towards and you're moving it around, then you get to see these two patterns. And what they're showing in the next, in F, is like if you don't have ReLU, so you don't enforce non-negativity in the RNN, then you don't really see, like, for example, these stark contrasts that you see in D. And so you don't see the same patterns. So they argue that like non-negativity and energy minimization lead to seeing the types of patterns that we see in the brain and why they develop and what they look like. So that was really quick. It actually took up more time than I was hoping. But yeah, that's a little bit about the neuroscience component of this paper. Really interesting paper. And now I'm going to open it up for questions or if people want to ask anything.
Peter, I've got a couple of questions. So cheers for the talk. Really interesting. I believe there are some couple of papers out there that do get recognition purely because perhaps the novelty is that they're trying to make us understand why our models that we've developed for deep learning since 2012, they work. This is a very good example. But I remember early in the talk, you mentioned that some of the constraints that they do make, it's intrinsically built in our deep learning models. So I think I saw that clearly when we said non-negativity is enforced when we use ReLU activations, right? Mm-hmm. But I didn't understand the second constraint, which is energy efficiency. I'm not sure how they, although could that be related to loss functions? Is that how?
So, yeah. Usually, if you look into the if you look into the optimizers we use for deep learning models today, they have like what's called one of the arguments in the code is usually our regularization weight, and usually what that's doing is it's enforcing the weight is this parameter here, beta weight, and the loss that's always enforced is this one here. So you almost always see weight regularization in your, you are almost always training your models with weight regularization unless you set it to 0, because I think the default is a non-zero value. So we do enforce weight energy minimization in our models. What we don't do is enforce activity and energy minimization.
So that's the real, the true novelty in the paper, that the extra L activity.
I don't think it's a novelty, because like I was saying before, we've seen other papers that try to enforce constraints on activation. But maybe it's a novelty that they're pointing out that when you enforce both of these, the novelty is that when you enforce both of these constraints, it leads to a disentangled representation. Because you wouldn't think that's the case. Like you're like, how does energy minimization lead to disentanglement?
Cheers, Peter.
Yeah. Cool. I will stop sharing. And I'll stop presenting.